Hi.
People like to believe that if you raise an animal yourself, feed it, love it, spend years earning its trust, then somehow you're different, and the rules don't apply to you. But history has shown that sometimes instinct doesn't care about familiarity. A woman in Pennsylvania learned that the hard way after being mauled to death by Teddy, the 350-pound
A
black bear she
bear
had
as
raised
a
for nearly a
pet.
decade. In Texas, a man trying to stop his own pit bulls from chasing strangers was suddenly turned on in his own driveway.
Come on now. You cannot keep a bear as a pet and expect it to just behave. It's a bear. I'd understand if it was a dog and then you're shocked, but a bear, bro? A bear. I don't know if it was a pet, but you cannot keep a bear as a pet and expect nothing to happen. That's all I'm saying.
Stop his own pit bulls from chasing strangers was suddenly turned on in his own driveway as neighbors desperately tried to pry the dogs off him. And in Florida, an 8-foot pet python escaped its enclosure in the middle of the night and slithered into a toddler's crib, ending in one of the most horrifying tragedies imaginable. These are the disturbing stories of
Eight
people who were
foot.
killed by the animals they trusted most. Killed
Eight.
by Teddy the
That's
bear. What do you even
insane.
do with a bear as a pet? Viewer, would you get a bear as a pet? And not metaphorically, an actual 350-pound black bear living in a steel cage in your backyard in the Poconos. That was what Kelly Ann Waltz and her family did in Ross Township, Pennsylvania, a rural stretch of woods about 30 miles northeast of Allentown where, if you drove past the property, you'd hear lions and tigers and God knows what else echoing through the trees. It sounds strange to us, but Kelly and her husband Michael had been doing this for over a decade. Their 8-acre property off Dogwood Lane had at various points housed a lion, a cougar, a jaguar, a tiger, a leopard, 2 servals, and the bear, a black bear she'd raised from a cub. She'd call him Teddy, probably a reference to teddy bears.
A whole zoo. A whole zoo in the backyard. What are you doing? I understand loving animals, but this is too much, bro. But I'd like to hear from you guys. Would you keep a bear as a pet? Or even a tiger? Would you do that? Put that in the comments because I know, man, the way I am, I wouldn't do that. Like, sometimes you just know these things are going to happen. And I'm not going to put myself in a situation where something like that could happen. You could literally just go to the zoo to see a bear, or maybe donate your pet to the zoo and then go check on it from time to time. I feel like that's more reasonable. But hey, I'd like to hear from you guys. Would you keep a bear in your backyard as a pet, or even a tiger, or any wild animal that's known to be a predator?
So she'd had him for 9 years. Her neighbor Scott Castone, a school teacher who lived about 130 yards away, said he used to feed Teddy popcorn through the cage. By October 2009, most of the other animals had died of old age, so it was mainly just the mountain lion, the tiger, and Teddy left on the property. Nothing bad happened until October 4th. On that specific evening, Kelly went in to clean the bear's enclosure. The cage was 15 by 15 feet, steel and concrete. Her method was the same as always. She'd throw a shovelful of dog food to one side to pull Teddy's attention away, then clean the other side while he was distracted. Castone said that she had done it 1,000 times before, but then something horrible happened. The bear turned on her. Her 2 young children witnessed the attack from the outside of the cage and ran for help. By the time anyone reached her, the
Oh,
damage was already done. Her neighbor, Castone, grabbed a handgun and shot the bear, but Kelly was already unconscious and was pronounced dead at the scene. She was 37 years old. She and Michael had just celebrated their 10th wedding anniversary. So before we get on to story number 2, I do want to let you guys know that these
that's so sad, man. And the children, the kids having to witness that happen to their mom. That's terrible. I cannot imagine witnessing that and having to grow up knowing what you've seen. They probably had to get therapy because ain't no way, bro. Ain't no way you witness that and just be fine. So that's very sad.
stories are a little bit shorter than the rest of my videos. We tried our best to find kind of obscure pets. We couldn't really find like a cat that killed anyone, you know? I also personally don't think anyone should be owning wild animals, unless of course you have a license to do so. But we are going to see some cases on this list where people just simply didn't have a license and they just wanted to have a, cool pet. With that being said, let's head on to the next one. Pitbull refused to let him go. Now, before we get into this one, I know that the dog breed of pit bulls is already pretty controversial. There's a whole movement to ban pit bulls. However, anecdotal advice, I know I'm just one guy with one story, but my friend used to actually have a pit bull and she was one of the nicest dogs I've ever met. But yeah, I don't want anyone that owns a pit bull to be like, oh, Tubbs simply put a pit bull on this list because he doesn't like pit bulls. No, I don't. It's just, this story caught my team's eye. Anyway, let's begin. A bear attack is something that, realistically, most people understand the risk of, but dogs are different. Supposedly, dogs are family, but they can equally be unpredictable. Pit bulls specifically have spent years at the center of this back and forth about whether they're dangerous or just misunderstood, with plenty of owners swearing by them as the most loyal, loving animals they've ever had. Eddie Castillo was probably one of those people. He was 45, living in Bay Cliff, Texas, a small unincorporated community about 15 miles north of Galveston. He had 2 pit bulls that, by all accounts, he took care of well. His neighbor Jesus Excontita had known him for 6 years and said the dogs grew up with Eddie, were always well fed, and had never given him a reason to think something like this was coming. But the sheriff's office later confirmed there had been previous calls to that area regarding aggressive dogs, and more than one neighbor mentioned they'd stopped walking down that part of Louisiana Avenue because of them. On the evening of October 12, 2025, around 6:30 p.m., the attack started when Eddie tried to stop his dogs from going after people passing by in a golf cart outside his home. That was the trigger. Within moments, both dogs turned on him instead, right there in his own driveway on Louisiana Avenue. Excontita heard the screaming from the next door and ran outside. What he found was Eddie being mauled, one dog locked onto his arm, not letting go. Excontita grabbed a machete and started swinging, but he broke the machete, so he grabbed the butcher knife, kept stabbing one of the dogs repeatedly, and it still wouldn't release. Meanwhile, his sister, Shane Starrett,
What the hell?
When the Galveston County deputy finally...
Brother, like, I know some dogs can be like that. Don't get me wrong, I don't think it's a thing that is like exclusive to pit bulls, but a lot of dogs can do that. But hey, take that with a grain of salt, because I've never owned a pet. I'll be honest, I've never had a dog, a cat, or anything like that. So I don't know, but I just know like any dog can be aggressive. Even if you raise a dog and it's just fine majority of the time, one day it can just decide to do that and you wouldn't know why. I guess because hey, it just happens sometimes. I don't know why. I don't know if pit bulls are more prone to doing it, but I've seen like in a lot of countries they call for like the banning of pit bulls. I cannot just say those people are saying that out of nowhere. There has to be a reason, right? So do put that in the comments. What do you think? Do you think pit bulls are dangerous? Do you think it's the people raising the animals? What do you put that in the comments? And if you own a pit bull, how are they like raising them? Is it easy? Do you have to go about it a different way or what?
arrived, one dog was still clamped onto Eddie's arm. The deputy shot it, and that's what made it let go. Eddie was rushed to HCA Houston Clear Lake and was pronounced dead there. Both dogs were euthanized the following day. Eddie Castillo was 45 years old, and by every account, he loved those dogs. His 500-pound pet deer kicked him dead. When people think of dangerous exotic pets, deer don't usually make the list. Bears,
That's
sure.
crazy,
Big
bro.
cats, yeah, but a deer? Gerald Rushton apparently saw things differently, because the 67-year-old man from Wisconsin, Texas, had been keeping wild animals in pens behind his house for years. To make things worse, it was a European red stag, which is a completely different animal from what most people picture when they hear the word. A European red stag is enormous. This one weighed somewhere between 500 and 600 pounds and had a full rack of antlers. To put that in perspective,
that's a
heavier than
huge
most horses.
animal.
Rushton was
A
keeping
big
a kennel
animal
behind his home on FM9 South. Along with other animals including Axe's deer, and his stated goal, according to investigators, was to domesticate them as pets. The thing is, this wasn't even his first run-in with authorities due to this. Back in 1994, 17 years earlier, Rushton had been arrested for illegally keeping white-tailed deer in his backyard. And to be clear, keeping a European red stag in Texas is illegal. Anyway, on the morning of November 12, 2010, Rushton went into the stag's pen to feed it. What happened next is something game wardens later said they'd never seen before in that area. The stag charged on him, pinned him against the fence with its body and antlers, gored him multiple times, and then trampled him when he went down to the ground. A 911 call came in, and when Harrison County Sheriff's deputies and Texas Parks and Wildlife game wardens arrived around 10:30 that morning, they couldn't even get into the pen to reach Rushton because the stag was still too aggressive to approach. They had to shoot it and kill it first just to get inside. By then, though, it didn't matter. Rushton was already dead, pronounced dead at the scene shortly after noon. What the sources point to as the likely trigger is that red stags go through a rut, a mating season, during which they become highly territorial and aggressive, even towards people they've been around before. So it's really not an unpredictable behavior for the animal. It's just biology. A wild animal that size and that
Like, I always knew like deer could be aggressive, but I didn't know they could actually take your life. And the way they did it, or the way the deer did it, that's a sad way to go out. That's a terrible way to go out. That sounds horrible. I've never heard of like deer doing something like that. Although I will say, like, I've always wondered why people are afraid of like stags. Like the way I always saw them like on movies and all that series, like people afraid to approach them. Now it all makes sense. They could be dangerous, and like the horns on these things, I don't know if to call them horns, antlers. Yeah, I think they're called antlers, but it does make sense because they look like they could pierce you with those. I don't know if they're sharp though.
state in a confined pen with nowhere to go and a person walking in, that combination was always going to be dangerous no matter how many times Rushton had fed it without incident. Smith County Warden Chris Green confirmed afterward that this was the first fatal attack of this kind ever recorded in that area. Gerald Rushton was 67 years old. He'd spent a significant part of his life drawn to keeping animals that the law and basic biology both said he shouldn't, and on a Friday morning in East Texas, that caught up with him in the most irreversible way possible.
And that's
In his
sad.
backyard, it killed him. Some people really seem to believe that a lion is just a very large house cat, and that if you raise it from when it's a cub, feed it, spend enough time with it, the animal will meet you halfway and behave accordingly. It's a mindset that shows up more than you'd expect, and these two cases, one in a Czech village and one in a South African wildlife lodge, are probably the clearest illustration of where that thinking leads. Mikhail Presek was 33 and lived in Zidikov, a small village in the eastern Czech Republic, about 350 kilometers southeast of Prague. In 2016, he bought a male lion from Slovakia and built enclosures for it in his backyard. Then he added a lioness the following year for breeding. The village had been uneasy about it from the start. Local authorities had denied him planning permission for the pens and fined him for illegal breeding, but Prasek refused to let anyone onto the property, and because there were no alternative facilities in the Czech Republic to relocate the animals to, and no evidence of cruelty, nobody could actually force the issue. It had been going on for years with no resolution, and the situation had already turned strange the previous summer when Prasek was walking the lioness on a leash outside, and a passing cyclist rode straight into her. An incident that police ultimately logged as a traffic accident.
Why would you do that?
Though, things went sideways really fast. His father found him dead inside the male lion's cage, the door locked from the inside. Police had to shoot both lions to get to the body. In short, he'd gotten too comfortable with the lion, went into the cage as he had many times before, but still being a wild animal, it attacked and killed him. The village mayor said afterward that the incident would perhaps finally help resolve what had become a very long-running problem, aka a fellow villager putting everyone in danger by trying to domesticate a lion. Now, Wes Matthewson's situation was about as far from
Why would you go outside with the lion on a leash? But then again, keeping the lion as a pet, like, I understand liking animals, but you don't have to like an animal like a lion so much that you desire to keep it as a pet. Because these animals are wild animals, and it's not like if you raise it from like from a cub, it's going to listen to you because it has instincts. It's a lion. That's what it does, bro. You cannot change that. Maybe you could get lucky, but it's not going to happen though. Let's be real. And a lion sounds like the worst one. Apart from like a crocodile, an alligator, this is an apex predator. That's why I'm saying like it's the worst you could have capped. That's insane, but rest in peace to him though.
Prasex as you could get on paper. He was 69, a conservationist who ran Lion Tree Chop Lodge with his family in South Africa's Limpopo province, and he'd hand-reared 2 white lionesses from cubs, animals he'd known for years and walked with regularly. Everyone in his circle called him Uncle West. Unlike Prasek, he actually was someone who had built an entire life around these animals and genuinely knew them, or at least believed he did. On August 26th of 2020, he was out walking the 2 lionesses on the lodge grounds. Again, like Prasek, this is something he'd done countless times before. Regardless, one of them attacked him with no warning at all. His wife Gil was driving just behind him and saw the whole thing happen. Tried everything she could to get him out, but she couldn't stop it. Mathewson died there on the property he'd spent his life building. The gap between these 2 men couldn't have been wider, and yet the attack on Mathewson came just as suddenly and with just as little warning as what happened to Prasek in that locked cage and Zedekov. Whatever either of them believed about their relationship with those animals, the animals weren't operating with the same understanding.
Yeah.
Pet python in toddler's crib. Among many exotic animals out there, I think it's not uncommon for people to keep snakes as pets, even big ones. There's a whole community around it, and most of the time, nothing goes wrong. Unfortunately, when something does go wrong, the consequences can be fatal. Jaren Hare had owned an 8'6" albino Burmese python named Gypsy for about 5 years before the night of July 1st, 2009. She lived with her boyfriend Charles Darnell and her 2-year-old daughter Shayuna in a rural home in Sumter County, and the snake lived with them in a glass aquarium in the house. Now for context, 2 important things here. The first is that the aquarium had no proper lid. They would just throw a quilt over it. That's it. And second is that Gypsy, the python, by the time that summer rolled around, was severely malnourished. In the early morning hours of July 1st, Gypsy pushed out from...
What do you mean? It didn't have a proper like. I think he said it didn't have a proper like closed lid or something like that. I'll have to run it back, but that's insane though. If that's what I heard.
It's 2 important things here. The first is that the aquarium had no proper lid. They would just throw a quilt over it. That's it. And second is that Gypsy, the python, by the time that summer...
They didn't have a proper lid for it. Then why keep it around if you know you have a child in the premises? Like, they should have gotten rid of it or kept it at a different location, maybe outside the house, in a barn or something like that, if you really wanted to keep it, but not in the same area as where you keep your child. That just seems like a risk to me. But hey, I wonder though, like where I live, there's not like a huge community around like having snakes as pets. How is that? Like if you're watching this and you own a snake, like do you feel comfortable around them? Can you teach them stuff? All that? How is that? So put that in the comments, please. I genuinely do not understand it. And I'm not judging, but I just want to know.
rolled around was severely malnourished. In the early morning hours of July 1st, Gypsy pushed out from under the quilt, made her way across the house and into Shayuna's crib. She bit her repeatedly on the arms and face, then coiled around her neck and asphyxiated her. Darnell called 911, and in that call, she said that the snake had gotten into the baby's crib and strangled her. Then he stabbed Gypsy to death himself. Immediately after, both adults were placed under arrest. At trial, they argued that Gypsy had always been docile and that nobody could have anticipated this happening, but that's a bit debatable. In fact, Florida's Department of Children and Families had actually been in that home 2 months earlier. A complaint had come in about the care Shayuna was receiving. A DCF investigator visited in May of 2009, and while he was there, he saw the python in its aquarium. He didn't report it to Florida Fish and Wildlife, the agency responsible for checking if the snake was safely housed. As it turned out, owning a python like that required a license, which Hare and Darnell didn't even have.
Oh, they didn't even have a license for it.
2 weeks before Shayuna died. So the jury took less than 2 hours to reject the "we didn't see this coming" claim. The foreperson said afterward that regardless of how remote the risk seemed, it was the couple's responsibility to make sure there was no possibility a 2-year-old could be harmed, and they failed to do that. The prosecutor told the jury that the snake wasn't at fault. It was a wild animal doing what a starving wild animal does. The fault was entirely with the two adults in that house. Both were convicted of aggravated manslaughter and child neglect and sentenced to 12 years in prison. Darnell was released in January of 2021, Hare 9 months later. Chayuna's father separately sued the Florida Department of Children and Facilities for wrongful death, arguing the state had every opportunity to intervene and didn't. His kangaroo killed him. We all know.
Yeah, I was just about to say, like, it sounds like negligence to me. Because how are you going to keep a snake in an aquarium without the lid? That just doesn't make sense. Some people,
Australia's
man.
wildlife reputation, right? That everything there is trying to kill you. Spiders, snakes, jellyfish, the sun. But a kangaroo looks a bit harmless on paper, right? In fact, most people's mental image of a kangaroo is either a boxing joke or something you see on a tourism poster, not an animal that can actually end your life. Peter Eads probably thought the same way, which is maybe why a 77-year-old alpaca breeder from Redmond, Western Australia ended up becoming the first person killed by a kangaroo in Australia since 1936. Peter was known around the Great Southern region as a dedicated animal person. He'd established the Agnes Alpaca Stud back in 1997, built up a herd of 60 animals, named every single one of them, and even built a small cemetery on the property to bury them when they died. He told the ABC in 2017 that when his time came, he wanted to be buried next to Claudia, his favorite alpaca. That's the kind of person he was, someone who formed real attachments to wild animals and treated them accordingly. So when a kangaroo Joey came into his life, he hand-raised it from the time it was small enough to fit in your hands. The problem was that a Joey you raise in your palms eventually becomes a 3-year-old male western gray kangaroo, and that's a fundamentally different animal. They can weigh close to 120 pounds, stand over 4 feet tall, and fight using their upper limbs to grapple. They shift their weight onto their tail, and then kick forward with both hind legs simultaneously, each one tipped with sharp claws. And the males, particularly around breeding season, become territorial and aggressive in ways that have nothing to do with how they were raised or how long they've known you. On Sunday, September 11th, 2022, Peter was attacked by the kangaroo on his property in Redmond, about 25 kilometers northwest of Albany. A family member found him later with serious injuries, and by the time the emergency services arrived, the kangaroo was still there and aggressive enough that the paramedics couldn't get close to Peter to treat him. Police shot the animal to clear the way, but it was already too late. Peter died at the scene. Wildlife carer Michelle Jones described exactly the shit that happened.
But you know what? From what I'm learning from these stories is that don't be around these animals during mating season because it seems like they get more aggressive. So it's to avoid them during the mating season if you're keeping them, because obviously I'm not going to keep a wild animal. But if you are going to keep one, just go for the docile ones, like the ones that are known to not be aggressive, just to reduce the chances of you getting killed by one. I feel like that's the safer way to go. And if you're into like dangerous animals, at least visit them at the zoos. You could see them there. Or maybe watch a video on the internet. Just like, I know it's not the same as like having one, but you could literally go. I don't know if they allow you to touch one at the zoo, but you could go to the zoo. I feel like that's more like understandable to do that. Because when that animal attacks you, because majority of the time you interact with it, you're going to be alone. No one is going to be there to help you. Understand that. And these animals are physically superior to human beings. Just bear that in mind.
Happens with hand-raised male kangaroos, that up to around 18 months they're sweet and gentle, and then the hormones come in, and the animal you thought you knew stops being that animal entirely. She'd raised Joey's herself and watched it happen. The sweetness just gets taken over by something older and stronger that was always going to surface eventually. Now, for your information, keeping a kangaroo as a pet in Western Australia requires a special permit that authorities almost never issued to private individuals, and there was no indication Peter had one. He was 77 years old, had spent his life caring for animals with genuine devotion, and was killed by one he raised from a Joey. Killed by Humphrey, his pet hippo. You know what it's called when a son kills his
Another
father?
dangerous
Patricide.
animal,
But does that word
hippo.
even apply to a 1.2-ton hippo that a South African army major had spent 6 years raising like his own child? Marius Els was 40, a former army major who owned a 400-acre farm in Free State Province, South Africa, where he kept giraffes, rhinos, and a hippopotamus he named Humphrey and adopted at 5 months old after the original owner said he was getting too big to handle. Els bought him in 2005, and from that point on, Humphrey had the run of the farm, swimming with humans, being ridden like a horse, coming when Els called his name. He described the animal as a gentle giant. He said he trusted him with his heart, that Humphrey would never harm anyone, and referred to their bond as something most people simply couldn't understand. The problem was that pretty much everyone around Els could see exactly what Humphrey was, even if Els couldn't. His wife Louise had doubts about the whole arrangement from early on, and the hippo had been giving people reasons to worry for years. At one point, a 52-year-old man and his 7-year-old grandson spent 2 full hours stuck up a tree after Humphrey chased them while they were canoeing on the river running through the property. Els eventually lured the hippo away with an apple while paramedics got the pair down. Humphrey also killed calves belonging to Els's business partner, regularly broke out of his enclosure, and had a habit of charging at golfers on a nearby course. And given that hippos can move at 30 miles per hour despite their size, that's not a minor inconvenience.
These things,
was a
man.
warning, and Els absorbed all of them and kept going. He still said, on record, that he trusted Humphrey with his heart and, again, that he didn't believe the animal would ever harm anyone. But on November 12th of 2011, Humphrey attacked him. Els's body was submerged in the same river where, years earlier, he'd rescued the hippo from a flood. Paramedics found him underwater with multiple bite wounds, and it was unclear how long he'd been there before anyone found him.
Tragic.
He was 40 years old. The thing about hippos that tends to get lost behind their size and their almost comedic appearance is that they are statistically one of the most lethal animals on the continent, killing more people than lions, elephants, leopards, buffalo, and rhinos combined. The males can weigh up to 3 tons and are built around an aggression that, like we've already seen, doesn't switch off because an animal has been
I was just about to say that, like, I bet a lot of people don't know, like, hippos kill the most people on the African continent. Or, I don't know if it's just the African continent, but they do more than lions, more than any animal you think kills people. Hippos, it's just that the PR they have is great, but they are machines. And the way they travel through water, you're not even safe when you're on land and in the water because they could run on land. If they can run in the water, they can run on land. So just avoid them. Stop thinking they're cute, they could be kept as pets. Just avoid them altogether. Unless you're with like a ranger or someone there to see what's happening, someone who knows them and understands that they're dangerous.
and raised or lived alongside humans for years. Els knew he was dealing with what he himself called the most dangerous animal in Africa and framed it as proof of how remarkable their bond was. But Humphrey had been showing everyone on that farm exactly what he was for years, and the one person most convinced otherwise was Marius Els. Strangled by Baby, his pet python. Dan Brandon had been keeping snakes since he was 15 years old. By the time he was 31, his bedroom in Church Crookham, Hampshire, housed 10 snakes and 12 tarantulas, and he knew enough about all of them that people who met him described him not as someone who liked snakes, but as someone who was really obsessed with them. Friends said you could barely find a photo of him where he wasn't holding something wild, like a snake, a spider, a hedgehog, a fox he was feeding in the garden. Animals were just the organizing principle of his life. The one he'd had the longest was an African rock python he called Tiny. He'd owned her since she was small enough to sit in the palm of his hand, and his mother Babs described her as his baby. She said Tiny would actually strike at her if she came into Dan's bedroom, as if she was protecting him. By the time Dan died, Tiny was 8 feet long. African rock pythons can reach 7 meters and weigh up to 90 kilograms, and they kill by constriction wrapping around their prey and squeezing until there's nothing left. Dan knew all of this. He'd even stopped draping Tiny around his neck in the months before his death because, as he told his mother, she'd gotten too strong and was too unpredictable. On the evening of August 25, 2017, Babs was downstairs cooking dinner when she heard a crash from Dan's room. She went up and found him face down on the floor unconscious with Tiny missing from her vivarium. The snake was eventually found coiled under a cabinet nearby. Paramedics were called, but they couldn't save him. The post-mortem found his lungs were 4 times heavier than normal, and there were pinpoint hemorrhages in one eye, along with a recently fractured rib. All these were signs consistent with asphyxiation. They did a deeper inquest, but it got more complicated than all this suggested. The coroner recorded a verdict of misadventure and concluded that Tiny was instrumental in Dan's death, but the theory was that she'd been coiling around him affectionately the way pythons do, and at some point something shifted. He fell or she tined without meaning to, and by the time things went wrong, there was nobody else in the room to help unwrap her. A snake expert who testified pointing out that the standard advice when handling a large python is to always have a second person present for exactly this reason, not because the snake is aggressive, but because if it coils and tightens, one person alone cannot get it off. Not everyone was convinced Tiny was responsible at all. The chairman of the Federation of British Herpetologists said openly he didn't know how a snake that size could have done it, and called the ruling into question. Babs Brannon said after the inquest that the family still didn't feel they had the answers they were looking for, and probably never would. She kept caring for Dan's snakes after he died, all 10 of them. His black widow spider bit him. When neighbors
Yeah, snakes have like bad PR. I'm not going to lie. Hey, I'm afraid of owning one. Not that I would, but it's one of the last things I'd own, bro. I'm wondering, like, is it fun owning one? Like, what's that like, bro? Where's the fun in owning a snake? What do you even do with it? Is this you like looking at it? Like, how does that work? Do you like taking it out and stretching it? I just don't get it, man. I'm not gonna lie, I don't get it.
in a Dortmund apartment building started noticing a smell coming from one of the units in 2004. Nobody had seen the man who lived there in a while, but that wasn't unusual. Mark Vogel was 30, kept entirely to himself, never had visitors, and that was generally the kind of tenant you knew existed in the building without really knowing anything else about him. When police finally broke in, they found out that Vogel had been dead for somewhere between 1 and 2 weeks, and his apartment had been running entirely on its own in the meantime. He had this whole ecosystem of wild creatures living with him. The apartment unit, located in Dortmund, housed a boa constrictor, several other snakes, poisonous South American frogs, roughly 200 spiders, several thousand termites,
200!
and helmet. The cages and terrariums were all open by the time police arrived. Giant webs stretched across the furniture, the room was bathed in a weird green light, and what remained of Vogel was on the sofa covered in cobwebs.
Oh
spiders
my
coming out of his nose
god.
and mouth, lizards having
What the hell?
flush away and drag them back to the webs of tarantulas and bird-eating spiders nesting the corners. One tarantula had built a nest the size of a swallow's in the ceiling. A police spokesman said it like it was a horror movie, which honestly feels very appropriate given what they were actually describing. But with so many dangerous animals around him, what exactly killed him? Well, it was a black widow spider he named Bettina. Black widow venom is a neurotoxin around 5 times more potent than a rattlesnake's and considered more lethal than cobra or coral snake venom.
Whoa!
Fatalities from black widow bites are actually uncommon, even when they happen, mostly because the volume of venom injected is so small, but Vogel was sealed inside an apartment with no one checking on him, and whatever happened after Bettina bit him played out with nobody around him to do anything about it. An animal expert who looked at the case said several of the species Vogel kept should never have been allowed in a private home, and that some of his spiders were so aggressive, they were the equivalent of a pit bull in the animal world. Police described the apartment as somewhere between a botanical garden and the butterfly breeding room from The Silence of the Lambs. But perhaps it's the sheer loneliness of the victim that makes this one of the saddest cases we've seen so far. Vogel only had Helmet the gecko and 2 weeks of silence before anyone even knew something had gone wrong. Her pack of 9 wolf dogs mauled her.
Hey man, that's a lot of animals.
Told her neighbor that her animals gave her unqualified love. She was 50, worked at a rehabilitation center in Latrobe, Pennsylvania, where she ran arts and crafts programs and spent her own money buying animated music boxes and toys for the residents because the department budget didn't stretch far enough. She'd been separated from her husband for years and lived alone in the same white house in Salem for maybe 2 decades. Well, alone except for the wolf dogs. 9 of them living in a fenced enclosure in her
Wolf
backyard,
dogs?
roughly the width of a 3-lane road, stocked with toys like a replica igloo, balls, and a plastic playhouse. She fed them roadkill and had recently asked a neighbor across the street to help her haul a deer carcass off Route 22 and back to the property. One of them, a wolf she named Spirit, lived inside the house with her. She'd raised Spirit from a pup. Quick note for anyone who has no idea what species we're talking about. Honestly, I didn't before this research. Wolf dogs are hybrids. They're the result of breeding domestic dogs with wolves, typically mixed with Alaskan Malamutes, German Shepherds, or Siberian Huskies, and they occupy this uncomfortable...
But why are we doing that, bro? Why are we breeding dogs with wolves? What are you trying to achieve? Like, it's not like wolves are known for being good. We have to be like aiming to achieve something. That's like trying to mate your house cat with a lion. What would you be trying to achieve? I don't see the end goal there. It just sounds insane to
Legal
me.
gray area where it's really hard to prove what an animal is. Sandra had registered hers with the county as crossbreed dogs, but when she sold pups, she identified them as wolves, which required a Pennsylvania Game Commission license she didn't have. The humane officer assigned to the area, Elaine Gower, had been out to the property around 10 times over 3.5 years. She never found evidence of abuse or neglect, but she'd made it clear to Sandra that the animals were unpredictable and that something could go wrong. Gower also knew that a friend of Sandra's had been mauled by one of the animals about 2 years earlier and never filed a report. On a Monday morning in July 2006, Sandra's family raised the alarm when she didn't show up to a breakfast they'd arranged. Her daughter went to the house and found her body inside the enclosure with the wolf dogs. The autopsy found she'd bled to death from multiple soft tissue injuries, with the worst wounds concentrated on her scalp and legs. The attack appeared to have stopped, the animals had turned on her and then at some point just quit. They estimated she likely died within minutes of the attack beginning. All 9 wolf dogs were euthanized afterwards. Gower said that the whole neighborhood
All
had been
9.
quietly afraid
All
for
of
years
them.
that those animals would get out and hurt someone. In the end, they didn't have to get out. Sandra was already inside with them. Farmer got eaten by his 50 stone pigs. Terry Vance Garner was a Vietnam veteran who came home with PTSD and found that farming was the thing that kept him steady. His brother Michael said the farm had been a lifesaver for him, and Terry took that seriously, filling the property near Riverton, Oregon, with all kinds of animals. Birds, turkeys wandering loose, giant pigs that he refused to sell for meat. That was the kind of operation he was running. Not a commercial farm, just a 69-year-old man and his animals. Now back to those pigs. They were enormous. Most pigs raised for market in the US weigh somewhere between 251 to 297 pounds. Terry's were sitting at 705 pounds
Yo!
each. I cannot imagine a
700
700-pound pig. I literally cannot imagine it. So they were more
That's
than double the average
enormous.
pig. He had several large adult sows, plus a boar he'd named Teddy. One of those sows had bitten him the previous year after he accidentally stepped on a piglet. He told his brother at the time that he was going to kill it, but when Michael asked him about it later, Terry had changed his mind. On a Wednesday morning in late September 2012, Terry went out to feed his hogs and didn't come back. A family member went looking for him a few hours later and found his dentures in the enclosure. Further searching turned up pieces of his body scattered throughout the pen, but the great majority of him had been consumed. Yes, he'd gotten eaten by the pigs. And the strange part about this whole situation was that while they knew Terry had died somehow and the pigs had eaten most of him, so little had remained of him that the pathologist couldn't establish a cause of death. The remains were sent to a forensic anthropologist at the University of Oregon to see if anything more could be determined. Investigators were looking at a few possibilities: that the hogs had deliberately knocked him over and attacked, that he'd suffered a heart attack or some other medical event and collapsed inside the pen before they got to him, or that foul play by a person was somehow involved. The limited remains made it impossible to land on any of them, so we can't say with certainty what happened to Terry. All we know is that the same
Pigs can just do that? They can just eat you? That's something that happens? Hey, I've never heard of something like this. Like, I know, like, some people can kill people and feed them to the pigs, but I never knew, like, they could do it themselves. That's crazy.
animals he'd spent years feeding and protecting were the ones that, on an otherwise ordinary Wednesday morning on the Oregon coast, left almost nothing of him behind. Her pet camel, a birthday present, killed her. What's the best gift for your wife's 60th birthday? Noel Weaver thought a feral camel was a pretty good answer to that question. The family had actually considered a llama or an alpaca first, but those turned out to be more expensive than expected, and living in Australia, where feral camels have roamed in large numbers since they were introduced in the 1800s, made a camel a surprisingly affordable option. So that's what Pam got. Hand-reared, bottle-fed, eating out of your hand, by every early account, a manageable enough animal for the couple's sheep and cattle ranch in the Mitchell area of Queensland. The camel was 10 months old when the attack happened in 2007, and in weeks leading up to it, it had already been showing signs of erratic behavior that should have been hard to ignore. It had developed the habit of knocking the family's pet goat over, straddling it, and lying on top of it, behavior that had to be interrupted multiple times, and that investigators and a camel specialist both later identified as sexual. A 330-pound animal working through that kind of impulse towards a goat is already a problem, but towards a 60-year-old woman, it was a bigger problem. So Pam's daughter was inside preparing dinner when she ran out to the garden after hearing something wrong. The camel had knocked Pam to the ground and was on top of her. By the time anyone reached her, the weight of the animal had done the damage. Investigators found one clear footprint on the side of her face and another on her arm. She didn't survive. Camels aren't naturally hostile animals, but as the specialist pointed out, they're also not domestic ones. And the gap between those two things is exactly where cases like this happen. Alright guys, that's going to be it for this video. If you like the way I explain these stories, make sure to leave a like. If you think I earned your subscription, it would be awesome if you could subscribe.
Yeah, that's crazy. Some of these animals, lions, snakes, I wouldn't keep personally. If it's a predator, I'm not gonna keep it. But I will say, like, I was shocked by the pigs. I didn't know pigs could just knock you over and just consume you. Like, I don't know how that happened, but I didn't know it was a thing. Hey, I'm shocked. Like, to me, like, if I were to own a pet, I always wanted to own, like, what do they call them? Doberman? Yeah, that dog. I think it's a really cute dog, and I want one of those. And that's about it. I wouldn't keep anything else. Like, but do, like, put in the comments. I'd really like to know, like, what do you guys have as a pet, and what would you be willing to keep as a pet? And do you think, like, keeping lions and all that, like, is a sensible thing to do? Put that in the comments. But anyway, I do hope you enjoyed this video, and on that note, thank you for watching, and I'll catch you on the next one.